Hi there. In this last of our early overview lectures, I want to talk about two very important concepts that will help us sort of frame how we look at African art, etic and emic. And I'll define these later on, but they define two different ways of looking at African art that sort of highlight the sculptural, physical qualities and the sort of subjective cultural areas and how we can sort of weigh and balance each of those respectively. This is an important distinction, what we see and then what the culture identifies as important are going to be two different things. And it can be frustrating at times, and it can be hard to know what to think or read. For example, when we take a look at this reliquary figure from the Kota people, it's a face, but the kind of sensibility that would go into making such an object and as a face seems really very foreign, very alien to us in a way, that we would try to understand this. Is it possible to really know how a people thinks about things when we look at something so strange and foreign to us and we're trying to figure out what to make of it, how to read it, and are anything we think or see about such object even closely resembles what they think and see about it. So, how do they see things differently? What can we see in their art? These are the fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves when we look at African art and any art. And it's easy to make assumptions about art that's even more familiar to us. African art just sort of highlights those differences in culture and time have wrought. So the question here, deep down, is how significant is culture in determining perception? So every culture has words for colors. Not every culture every language has a word for every color. But if they have a word for red, whether it is rojo or mera or anything else in between, are they seeing the same color? They have a different name for it. Is it possible that they just see red differently than we do? Well, here's a test. If I was to ask you which one of these was the best example of the color red, you'd probably gravitate to C, all right? All the other are red-ish in a manner of speaking, but C is brighter, higher intensity, deeper, more clearly defined as what we see as red. And what's interesting about this test, which seems sort of obvious to us, is that if you were to do this test, and if you were to include even a much larger range of spectrums of possibilities, people from all over the world, no matter what they called the word red, if they had a word for red, they would point to C, almost invariably, okay? Now, of course, there are biological differences with people who are colorblind and other kinds of mental disorders that might skew someone's perceptions. But with an ordinary brain and eyes, we can say without much debate that no matter what you call red, you're seeing the same color. And I think this is a good fundamental thing to establish at the get-go, that despite all of our differences in culture, they do not fundamentally change some of the primary aspects of our perception, because color is really determined by the makeup of our eyes and how the cones in our eyeballs fire and our brains interpret that firing. That even though we may have a different word for it, and even though that color may symbolize different ideas and cultural thoughts and feelings, the basic notion that color is perceived the same is universally true. We can say without much debate. So there are long-term debates that are going on about cultural ideas versus biological conditioning. This nurture versus nature. What are we born with? and what does our culture determine? And we'll talk more about what is culture later. But at this point, we just have to figure out, what makes us essentially human, and what makes us a part of our culture, and how do we perceive and identify things. Some people have called this the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, where these were two anthropologists who observed that certain cultures had a plethora of vocabulary concerning certain aspects of their lives, and that this was a sort of endemic of their cultural values. Wherever there was an abundance of a certain kind of terminology that showed that they perceived the world differently. And you probably heard this idea that there's some, 60-odd words for snow among the Inuit and Eskimos of the North. And, well, yes, there are lots of words for snow up there, where snow is much of what you experience in your lives. They have very fine ways of determining these things. But for most of us, we also have a fairly large vocabulary for describing snow, and we can combine things together, and it has some sort of a trick of their language. So the debate has continued, though, as people are trying to understand, does language impact the way we perceive things? And this is sort of this linguistic relativity hypothesis, that somehow, if we have a word for something, does it change the way we think or about that thing? So let's go back to color, because I think we've established already that we see things in the same way. That there is a kind of hierarchy because of the way our eyes are made, and that this chart exemplifies that most people, if they have words for color, they're usually simply just light and dark. Okay, if they have 3 color terms, there would be light, dark, and red. If they had 4 color terms, it would be light, dark, red, and then one of the next 3, blue, green, or yellow, and so on. And then after they've got those terms covered, they might have a word for brown, and then further on. You can see there's an order of complexity here that is expanding as the vocabulary increases. And this is the way all languages work. As far as anyone can tell, all human languages follow this pattern. Okay, so there's a hierarchy of perception. So now let's take an example, a study that was done from the Dani people of Papua New Guinea. They had only 2 words for all languages, a kind of cool, dark, and a light, warm colors. And whatever they saw, they distinguished between these 2. So the question was, can they see other colors? Are they capable of perceiving them? And so these anthropologists, they went there and they actually were able to teach them new color terms based on their kind of linguistic preferences, and created new terms. And it was interesting that the terms that were most memorable were the ones that sort of fit within the spectrum of what you would expect in this hierarchy of perception. So it is possible that cultures can change. We are not limited by our perception, by the language we use. We can and do see more colors than our language provides us words for. And so I think we have to understand that culture, though it does limit us in some ways, it doesn't delimit us for all time and forever. Now, there are really subtle areas where culture terms may allow people to think of terms or in words in different ways. And so subtler shades of blues and greens, whether you might think of something bluish or greenish, might be determined by how you pronounce or think of the word in terms of its cultural context. And so color categories do create some subjective boundaries, especially when those boundaries concern larger cultural concepts in terms of gender and class and aesthetic values. All these things are more, but there is no actual firm evidence that color appearance or the color threshold discrimination is affected by color terms. So again, there is an objective component to our perception, and then there is a subjective component to our perception based on our cultural boundaries. Okay, so the language we use and identify with really does create a kind of sense of cultural boundaries. It's a this or it's a that. Gender roles, it's a male or it's a female. Class distinctions, or sometimes even gender roles might consider, some cultures have a third gender, a hermaphrodite, that they also attribute. This is gendered, ungendered role. Class distinction, who's upper class or low class, highbrow, lowbrow, lots of words we use to indicate economic divisions. And then, of course, aesthetic values, things that we think are beautiful, the words we use for things that are beautiful, things that we appreciate and value, things that we find disgusting and disturbing. These values embed themselves in the art we make by the words we use to describe the art. So as much as possible, we want to learn what are those terms that the culture uses to describe their own work. And we're going to do a lot of that. I'm giving you a lot of terms, and I want to make sure that you can effectively use them to describe the work that the people have made. So there are two things we're going to talk about here. The etic or phonetic is a part of the structural elements that are not culturally determined. So it's in that chart of the hierarchy of forms, when we're looking at all those colors, regardless of the names they're given, there is a hierarchy there in our visual perception that we can call the etic description of color, okay, that humans perceive. Etic is a sort of objective analysis of colors. It is not as subjective in terms of culture. It is clearly something. An emic from phonemic is something that is a unit with cultural meaning. Okay? And so when we think about a phonemic unit, like the word dog can't be shortened any more than dog, though we have the word dog house, we know of those as making up two phonemic elements, right? The dog and the house. And each of those creates a new concept because of that. Below, we see the etic description of the word dictionary, because the words don't actually describe the sounds. We need to have an etic system for describing words, not just the way they're spelled, because the spelling of a word is very culturally determined, linguistically determined. So in this way, what we find is these two systems help us define and describe objects in a way that allows us to see what it is objectively, and also at the same time, in other categories, what it is, how it is culturally determined. Now, let's apply etic and emic to works of African art. Here is a collection of Kuba raffia cloth. Okay, the Kuba people have this work of art. There's raffia cloth weavings, and it all performs the same function, right? Now, we know that's all considered the same thing, but clearly looking at them, we can see they're different. Each one has a very different kind of design, all right? So there's similarities and there are differences that we can perceive. The similarities are those elements which are culturally determined because they have one name for all of these items, Kuba raffia cloth. We know that they all functionally perform the same role, right? So we know that the variations that we see must be culturally accepted variations within that category. Or even not even culturally accepted, culturally expected. They assume that there's going to be these kinds and expect these kinds of variations in the work. Okay? So when we look at Kuba raffia cloth, we can see that they are all roughly square, right? And within that square piece of cut pile cloth, we see a design which works on the diagonal. And there's light and dark areas and linear elements that are kind of linked and woven together. And so those are sort of the common areas that seem to define the concept of Kuba raffia cloth. And then within that, we can see that there's an extraordinary range of patterns and designs that interlock in kind of asymmetrical ways, kind of creating a kind of unified and yet enormously varied field. And that's what makes these costs so interesting, right? So what is etic? Is those things that we can observe that show variation within the cultural context. What is emic about this? Those are those things which are common to all these objects that are culturally determined, belonging to a single category. All right, let's try this again. This is a wholly new idea, I'm sure. So here we have Soe mask from the Sande Society. These masks have one term, one word for them. People recognize these all as belonging to the same cultural category, right? So they are emically the same. But ethically, we can look at them and see a variety of differences, okay? So what are the similarities that allow them to belong to this category? We see these are faces of women. We see that they have a tall, pointed forehead. We see they have a small chin, nose, mouth, and ears. And we can say that there are these rings on their necks and these very fancy hairdos. That seems to be the categories that describe these generally to belong within the category. Now, what's interesting to note is where is there the greatest difference in all of these? If you look, you'll see that the greatest change in all of these is the hairstyle. It seems like the hairstyle is the one area that sort of allows for the greatest variation and still belonging into this category of the Soe mask. And that's a very interesting thing. We've learned that there's certain parts of the face that must more or less conform to certain ideas of what the type must be, right? To belong to the emic category, it must have these elements. But we can also see there are certain areas that seem to allow for or invite enormous variety of possibilities. So we can start just by looking at a variety of pieces, we can start to analyze and make sense of a kind of cultural values that people may have. Oh, they accept this variation, but not so much these variations. All right, you getting comfortable with this? One last time. These are Shitani statues. These are sort of sculptures that are made in East Africa from hard, dark wood. And we can see these statues are carved in a variety of very fanciful and outrageous forms and designs. But if we look at them, we can see a number of similarities to all Shitani. First of all, there's something sort of comical about them. They're sort of drippy biomorphic forms that sort of look like elbows, arms, legs, and features of faces that are kind of swirling around in an organic way. Okay, so that's sort of the features that make them similar. So if you see something like this, you say, oh, that must be a Shitani, okay? You can start to figure out the abstract forms and how they kind of come together to create a unique cultural idea. All right, so that's emic and that's etic, and that's how these concepts work and how we can use them to understand some of the basic cultural categories and variations within those cultural categories.